Welcome to the Global Education Station Presents. I'm Annette Levesque, your host, education and technology strategist, and author of eLearning Gold, the ultimate guide for leaders. In each episode, we explore innovative ideas and best practices in education, connecting with directors, CEOs, authors, and thought leaders. Together, we'll share stories and insights to inspire and engage learners globally. Today, we're joined by a remarkable leader in global education, Julia Dicum. With nearly 30 years of experience, Julia has worked as a teacher, researcher, and policy analyst across Canada, Egypt, the UK, Malaysia, Pakistan, the West Bank, and Gaza. Currently, she is a director of education at the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees, where she oversees education for 543,000 students and 8,000 vocational trainees. Julia is known for her collaborative leadership and commitment to inclusive teaching, ICT for education, gender equality, and student empowerment. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you, Annette.
I'm so glad to have you here today. And I was just wondering, maybe we could get started by having you share a little bit about your journey and what led you into your current position at the United Nations Relief and Works Agency.
Sure. So I came into education probably a little bit through a side door in some ways. When I was a teenager, going way back, I was in a class in high school on a political science class, actually, which was rare to have in high school. And we did a big unit on the United Nations and how it worked. And we did a model United Nations General Assembly. And my teacher assigned everybody to a different country, mostly countries in the developing world. And I ended up being assigned Libya. And that was my introduction, in a way, to the Middle East region. Though not, and the United Nations. And I really just became completely enthralled with it and needed to know more. I needed to learn more. I went to university and studied political science and Middle Eastern history, and then did my master's also in Middle Eastern studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOAS, in London, England. And graduated and thought, well, now I'm going to light the world on fire, of course. But I graduated during a recession in Canada and a time when the public service, including the diplomatic service, was shrinking. So it was difficult. And I fell into teaching English as a second language in Asia. And I had always worked on the side in education. I had taught swimming and lifeguarding and life saving. And really, it was just a sort of natural happenstance, I guess, or a natural progression. And from there, I thought I'd really like to work more in international development and in the education sector. And I had the good luck to win a spot in an internship that the Aga Khan Foundation had for, and still has actually, but it's called the International Development Management Fellowship. And that took me to Pakistan and to the world of international development, project management, strategic thinking, and design, and work specifically in the education sector and outside of the classroom and in management. And so that's how I ended up in the sector. I eventually went back to school and did a PhD in education in the area that I'd worked in for a number of years, which was refugee education and education in emergencies. And the act of going back to school had brought me into the world of ICT for E. And it was very early days of the internet. This was the early 2000s. And but refugee students I'd worked with in Pakistan. They were Afghan refugee students, had followed me around the refugee camp, asking me to get them computer lessons and access to the internet. And that's how really they had inspired me to ask questions during my PhD. And I ended up having sort of a side interest in research and work in that area for my whole career up until now. So that's how I ended up in education, and why I say it's a side door. I work and have worked for many years with many, many fine educationists who spent many more years teaching in the classroom than I did, and primarily in the area of primary education, especially those who work in international development. Whereas I was more interested in teenagers and young adults, and of course was teaching also at the university. So it was a very different way of getting into the sector than most people have. My current position was, and I have worked for 16 years, I think. Yeah, 16 years for the Public Service of Canada at CETA, and other departments, and particularly at Global Affairs Canada. And I was looking for a different kind of challenge after about 10 years or so of it, maybe 12. And I decided to launch out, and I ended up becoming a director at SSHRC, which is the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, where I managed the scholarships and fellowships program for 2 years. And while I was there, I heard that the UN was looking for a new director for UNRWA. And I thought, well, I could go back into the international. It would also help me professionally, or give me a good opportunity late in my career to go back to the field that I love, to focus on refugee education. One of, if not the only, a fully accredited education system for refugees in the world, and one of the oldest. And a lot of my work in refugee education has been in long-time refugee or chronic refugee situations. So I really thought, and it's in the Middle East, which is the region that I love. So how could I not apply? So I applied, and that's where I am today.
That's amazing. And when you talk about being able to get students computer lessons and access to the internet when they're in a refugee camp or in an emergency situation, how do you do that?
Yeah. So, well, that wasn't easy. It was impossible in the year 2000 when I was first asked this question. Their electricity was not available. Alternative like solar and wind and so on was not in a place where you could use it reasonably. And it was really quite impossible. The students, they were the teenage boys, actually, and many refugee camps around the world are near urban areas, or in urban areas, or right beside urban areas. And these particular boys, these Afghan refugee boys, used to play soccer with boys from the local village or town. It was really more of a town. And that town had electricity and internet cafes, early versions of them. And so they suggested that we send them to the town to learn at the internet cafes in town. But it was really not within our means to do so. And in fact, they heard about it from the boys they were playing soccer with, right? That's where they got interested in the whole idea. But in nowadays in emergencies, it depends very much on the emergency and what kind of infrastructure you already have there, right? So if you have access to the electricity grid and the internet, you can make it work. Of course, there's satellite internet as well, but satellite is unstable and very, very expensive, and beyond what most education providers can afford. So uh, it's there has been some success. I haven't been involved so much in that success in other crises, to bring in tablets and different types of learning tools that way, as a way of having a higher quality or learning continuity in an emergency, like a true acute emergency. But the reality, Annette, is that in most emergencies, you don't have uh, all of those luxuries. So the innovation still is paper and pens.
Yes.
But we forget, right, that
Mm-hmm.
a pen, when it was invented, was a major revolution. And then the ballpoint pen, even bigger revolution. Paper and mass production of paper, although it's very bad for trees and the environment, was also a huge, huge innovation. Before that, paper had to be handmade. Very few people had it. If only a few people knew how to read and write. So society has really moved. The world has really moved in the last 4 centuries on these issues, and sometimes that's the best thing.
Mhm. Absolutely. When I visit schools in developing countries, it's just amazing to me. Like you say, paper and pen, and how we kind of take it for granted here. But it's
Yeah.
astounding how you can deliver a set of new notebooks and pencils and pens to students, and they treasure them as though you've just delivered gold into some
Yeah.
schools. And with the electricity component, it's actually interesting. So when I'm, scouting for e-learning, the first thing I do when I go to a school is look to see if they have electrical outlets and if they're working or not. And we forget these things, and
Yeah.
in some countries as well, even if they have electricity, if there's rotating power outages, some of the virtual learning systems can't be delivered in exactly the same way. And it's something that educators need to know when they're delivering to an
Yeah.
alternative or developing country, or students who are living in not optimum circumstances for schooling.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you enjoyed the teenagers, working with teenagers and high school
Yeah.
students. Are you able to, in the absence of electricity, deliver books to them? How does that work?
Yeah. I mean, so for UNRWA in particular, our education system is spread over 5 different fields: uh, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, West Bank, and Gaza. And in all of them, they use textbooks. We use the textbooks of the Ministry of Education in each one of those 5 fields. So it's 4 different ones, because in West Bank and Gaza, it's the Ministry of Education of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. And we use the textbooks that we are required to use in order to teach the official government curriculum of our host authority. Um, so the textbooks in most of our fields are actually generously provided to us by the ministry and delivered. We are involved in co-organizing the logistics to make sure that they get received and then delivered to our schools. But and in some cases, some years, I mean, you know, UNRWA is famous for one of the things we're famous for is that we have a financial crisis permanently. So we're very grateful that when the ministries don't charge us for their textbooks, but in fact, uh, they also are, because they're all middle income countries. So they are also often under great financial stress and have a difficulty printing their books and so on. But there's a great interest throughout the region, and including in all 5 of our host authorities, in digital education as a way of delivering material but unfortunately, it's not lower cost, as you well know, Annette, as an expert in this area. It costs more to deliver material, and it's different kind of material. We experimented at UNRWA during the COVID-19 pandemic with the development of lessons for our teachers to deliver in hybrid mode or in fully online mode with a teacher present, so not self-learning. And it was our first foray organizationally into the development of such online material. It's what I think an experienced ICT for E leader would call flat. It's PDFs. There's no bouncing balls. We haven't coded it. There's no little animals running around in cartoon-like fashion, or when you get the answer right, nothing happens. It's just your teacher tells you got the answer right. So I would like to see our efforts in that area move in a more dynamic direction. Like everywhere else in the world, our students are suffering from learning loss due to COVID. Our students and of course also the current conflict happening in the West Bank and in Gaza, and also affecting our operations in Lebanon. So and Syria was devastated last decade for years by war. So our operations there are also still suffering, and our students are suffering in terms of their ability to learn, whether or not they're in a safe environment to learn and an encouraging environment to learn. So materials are very important. Renewing them, I think, is important, and being able to teach them things that they want to learn so that we're engaging with them. But of course, we in such a way that we're still meeting the ministry requirements, and in such a way that the curriculum and the required lessons and progression of lessons is still being taught in the same way that we need to teach it.
Mm-hmm. And which ministry mandates your requirements? Are you speaking of the local ministry in the host country, or
Yeah.
are you talking about here?
No, the Ministry of Education in each of our host countries.
That's amazing that they're able to do that and that they
Yeah.
will deliver the books.
We're one
Do you
of
ever
the few refugee education programs that I know of which is fully accredited by our host authorities. And it is a game changer for
Right.
our students, because when they finish, we mostly, in most of our fields, we're only teaching grades 1 to 9, with the exception of Lebanon, where we teach grade 1 to 12. And so in the other fields, at the end of the program with us, they are able to transition either to TVET or to higher secondary education. And following that, they can they'll graduate with an accredited high school diploma, which opens up possibilities for them for higher education, whether that's in the host country, or sometimes, the best and brightest get scholarships to go overseas or to another country in the region. So as a result, you can meet Palestine refugees all around the world who have completed university education, and it's never been an issue. In other refugee scenarios, there's always those of us who manage them are always embroiled in a debate about the accreditation, the future for the students, their ability to translate their education into job opportunities, including higher education, and then, white collar job opportunities, or any kind of skilled employment that requires higher education. And there's never been an easy answer on it. But in the case of Palestine refugees, from the very beginning, this has been a hallmark of our program and a hallmark of our effort. So, yeah, our students do well. They do well also compared to the students from the host authority communities. And generally speaking, our considered excellent students across the region.
Hmm. And do you ever run into any issues when it's the accreditations provided by the local ministry and the resources where the ministry will not provide those resources depending on a student's nationality within a country? Have you encountered that at all?
No, we've negotiated this for many, many, many years, and many years ago, and it's been a a key hallmark or a key part of our work. So as UNRWA, but that
Hmm.
sets us apart from other refugee scenarios. So we have a very good relationship with the host authorities and with the Ministry of Education in each of the host countries, and they really are excellent at trying to make sure that Palestine refugees have full access to education. Of course, in most of them for university, it's complicated because there are some. I think most of them have tuitions involved, and paying for their tuition is
Right.
prohibitive for many people. But many have been able to go, regardless of that. So yeah, it is a little bit different how it works in each of the 5 fields, but the basics of the relationship and are there.
That's amazing because I've encountered that in several countries where, students, especially when it comes to documentation as well,
Yeah.
many times, students arrive in a country and they don't have the appropriate documentation. And that becomes an issue for registering into an official school program and
Yeah.
accreditation and receiving resources and all of those things. So I probably will have more questions for you about that
Sure. We're
afterwards. I'm
fully
very
accredited
curious.
in each of our 5 fields.
But
So
even let's
yeah.
say, for instance, in Malaysia, when I was working in Malaysia a number of
Mm,
years ago, some of those resources were provided for Malay students, but not necessarily students of other nationalities. But
mm.
maybe that's part of your designation and the designation of your organization that allows for that.
I think it's part of the special relationship
Hmm.
between um, the different host authorities and between the UN and their host authorities, both those responsible for Palestine refugees and the ministries of education. So they do
Right.
they value our work and our efforts in this area, but I appreciate that in some of our host countries, there are other refugees who are not Palestine refugees, and they they don't fall under UNRWA's mandate, and they may have different experience in terms of access to fully accredited education, but it's a work in progress in several of them.
Right. And then when we talk destination, so
Right.
accreditation in the local countries, you mentioned students can apply sometimes to also leave the country and study elsewhere, but
Mm.
not all credentials are recognized equally. So how do you get that part working?
Yeah, I mean, for higher education, of course, we maintain a database of our students and their results. It's the Ministry of Education in each of our 5 fields that will provide like the stamp of accreditation, um, recognition of our grade 1 to 9. It it will go hand in hand with if the ministry has stamped the documentation as well. Then it's considered, uh, the but I mean, I hear you. It depends where the student is taking it, um,
Hmm.
and that's sometimes out of our control. Then where they're going will, they'll have different systems in place that we don't get involved in necessarily.
Right.
But yeah, but because we're accredited by these 5 or 4 ministries of education, so once it's got the stamps on it and they've got all the information, uh, depending where the student is going, they will the, the receiving government will uh, do something to make sure that they can fit in seamlessly into the new system. For university access, it's easier if it's in the host country or if it's in the region, because the host country's education systems are all recognized regionally, but there may be different requirements, as there are in universities, everywhere in the world. And we tend to facilitate, but not to be too involved in that.
Right. And then when it comes to curriculum development, so here, even in Canada, where we have a provincial curriculum for, different curriculum for every single province, it becomes extremely onerous on teachers and educators trying to share resources, especially in these days of, advanced technologies, and resource sharing is everything. Why do we need to reinvent the wheel? Although I guess maybe AI is helping out a little bit now.
Yeah.
But, that's Canada. How do you go about developing curriculum for 4 different ministries?
So we don't develop the curriculum. The curriculum is the government's. And so you mean materials?
Exactly, the teaching of the
materials,
curriculum. Yes.
I think, yeah. So, or curricular materials. So we tend not to develop our own materials. We have a few supplementary materials that we do develop our own. We have a well-regarded human rights and conflict reduction and tolerance education program, or here's a good acronym, HRCRT, that we've had since 1999. And that teaches human rights and conflict resolution and tolerance, peace, and various other issues. We also use it for student empowerment and democratic citizenship, in that we have a student parliament that's funded under the same program, and the students become involved. They become empowered, and they get encouraged to support their own community, and to do community projects to support themselves and one another, as well as the wider community. So that project is a separate curriculum. It's been reviewed by our host ministries of education, and agreed to, even though it is a supplementary. So most of our host countries, there is a set curriculum. There is a set of textbooks, but how you teach it in the classroom can be a little bit different. But we strictly adhere to those in order to maintain our accreditation. So there's not as much, perhaps, creativity as a Canadian teacher would be used to. But I am well aware of the anomalies in Canada regarding the management of education. We are the only country in the world that I know of where there's really no federal Ministry of Education, and a very limited role for like Stats Can or Statistics Canada in monitoring national statistics. And certainly when I used to work at Global Affairs Canada, this issue was mind-blowing to ministries of education, as well as even just people who worked in other donor governments and foreign affairs ministries from developed countries. They could not wrap their head around how it is that Canada has no federal Ministry of Education. But the Canadian system and reality is actually really helping me in my current position, because we have 5 fields and four different curricula and 4 different ministries of education whose requirements we have to meet. And it's all one big balancing act, just the way it is in Canada. But
Absolutely.
we're actually currently working towards establishing a community of practice for our school counselors. So there's a lot of conflict and war and tension throughout all 5 of our fields. So we have a bit of an education and emergencies program in all 5 fields. And so we have school counselors who are there to do psychosocial support and activities relating to the stress and trauma that the children face every day from being part of the war and conflict that is around them. And we have a plan to really create a community of practice between our school counselors in all 5 fields at the moment. And I'm just literally today was asking my team lead on this to explain to me how this is going to work given our highly decentralized program. So I'm waiting for the answer. I haven't got it yet. So that might have to happen in part 2 if we ever have a part 2 conversation.
No, absolutely. It floors me. It's so great that you have the resources provided. In countries that don't, here, every time the curriculum changes, new textbooks are created and new books are issued. And whenever I see ESL books going to recycle warehouses, I am cringeworthy. And I just want to, gather them up, talk to school boards, gather them up and have them donated to children in need. But of course, we run into things like also the shipping costs to get them into countries. And in one country...
And countries, all these countries have their own Ministry of Education with their own curriculum and their own requirements, right? But it's true. The same thing happens in all of our 5 fields. We all wait for a renewal of a revision of the curriculum, or new textbooks to roll out. And of course, like ministries of education in any other middle income or lower income country, they don't always have the money to update as frequently as a developed country does, or to modernize as frequently or as much as a developing country or a developed country does. And it is a big challenge. Education ministries around the world are sort of famous for being cash strapped, and the ones we work with are no different, as well as our own program. Our own program is very much financially in a difficult situation, and it really makes it very difficult for us to focus on modernizing or upgrading, even doing proper digital learning or integrating ICT for E in different dynamic methods, and in teaching skills to the children that are not necessarily included in the curriculum of our host authorities, and doing things differently and better. But I dream that we can do it. I know that we can do it. It requires ingenuity and thinking things through differently, and thinking about the use of digital tools differently, but also pens and paper and other more traditional resources differently.
I visited schools where they don't have any resources at all. And typically it's because I can think of one particular one actually where they had 500 students in the morning and 500 in the afternoon because they couldn't fit them all for a full day. And in fact, siblings in the same family would often have a school uniform, and the student in the morning would wear that, go to school, come home, take it off, share it with their sibling who would then go to school. And even basic supplies were difficult to get, let alone books. Typically it's because the nationality of the student is not recognized by the government, or perhaps even frowned upon by the government in that country. And so that's always been an issue where we're looking at, okay, even if we can get the books donated, how do you bring them through? There's only so many that will fit in my luggage as I'm traveling. Or, I usually bring a laptop or two each time I go, and it lights up a school. But having recognition from the local ministry makes a big difference in those efforts with the schools, for sure.
Yeah.
How do you see the future of education evolving in emergency situations or war-torn areas? Like, where do you think we're going? Is there more we can be doing to help? Yes.
Always. There's always more to be doing. You know, the before the year 2000, the term education in emergencies didn't exist. Refugee education existed, both in terminology and in practical sense, but there was no concept of education in emergencies. So it's been about 25 years, and it's been a huge part of my career. And I've really seen globally a shift. You know, the term was coined, and the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies was started by actually leads on education for different UN agencies and a small handful of international NGOs. And that's since been expanded many, many fold. I mean, it has, I think, over 10,000 members now, both individual and institutional. And um, and really, it's the professionals within the humanitarian aid and development system who were already working in this space, who really drilled down, worked together, and created things like the minimum standards for education in emergencies and other key critical tools, and therefore agreement on how to do it, the way forward, what to do in an emergency, what the systems and processes are. Before that, in an acute emergency, we have always had, teachers do what they do best. I was saying earlier today to somebody that it's a skill. And once we've taught somebody how to, or trained somebody in how to teach, they see where they can do it, and they always do it all the time. So, teachers have a tendency, as soon as they can, to try to get the kids together and start teaching them. And we see this in emergency after emergency after emergency. The education in emergencies sector, as a professional sector, aims to get involved in that as soon as possible, ensure that there's funding available so that you can bring in the resources or bring in kits like emergency education kits. Schools in a Box were an early innovation of this sector, and different kinds of ready-made kits. So you can just open and start teaching, even though maybe you don't have textbooks. Suddenly you have notebooks, you have pens, you have crayons, blackboard paint or blackboards, and chalk and so on. And so that you have the basics, maybe not walls, but maybe you'll have a tent, or maybe you won't even have that, right? So, but people are very quick now with their training in efforts to move from emergency to some psychosocial support to school. Putting school back together again in a routine of school is incredibly important in emergencies for getting communities back on track, for bringing in stability, for letting people feel and know that everything will be all right, because the family routine from before that emergency is back. By which I mean, you all know the kids are going to school the next morning, so you've got to get them to bed, get their clothes ready, make sure they're fed in the morning, if you have food, because that's a whole other issue that is close to my heart. And then send them off or take them to wherever the school will be, whether it has walls or not. Let them do their thing, and then bring them home again. Make sure they're, fed or have done their homework or are in bed on time, because the next day you're going to do it again. And this kind of routine brings families together, brings people together, and brings stability in the most difficult crises. It is so important, but we still have a long way to go. Within the humanitarian sector, education is still not prioritized as one of the early critical interventions, even though educationists have proven over and over again that it is essential to start it as soon as you possibly can in an emergency, and that it doesn't have to be in a bricks and mortar school. It doesn't have to be so formal, and that's essential, not just for the stability, but also for learning continuity. Children can forget how to learn to read and write. These are essential skills, and the longer they're out of reading and writing, the harder it is to bring it back. So the faster we can get them learning their basic literacy or remembering their basic literacy and numeracy, the more we have to build on. And while we get schools ready or get temporary learning spaces or fabricated skills ready for them to restart more of a formal education, we can. So this is the basic reality of education in emergencies. But yes, there is still so much to do. When the international community started Education Cannot Wait, which is a global fund whose specialization is education in emergencies, and they fund both for acute first emergency response as well as for multi-year crises. That was a game changer. That was, I should say, another game changer in a list of 25 years of game changers. And that was probably one of the most recent changes in the system. And it now means, as I've seen in Gaza, that there are funds available that are dedicated to education in emergencies. So we can take funds and we can start working in that field without worrying that emergency appeal funds for food and water and shelter and health are not available for those very critical needs, or that we're fighting with those sectors for critical needs. Instead, we have a dedicated fund that we get some money for, and the kids are able to sit down and start learning much earlier in the process than they otherwise would. But we still have a long way to go. There's not enough money in the system, of course. There are still many, many people who don't believe that in the importance of education in emergencies, including, important actors in the humanitarian sector. So I think that we really still need to advocate for that acute emergency education action and activity. And we really still need to think through how we maintain funding availability so that it is available and there are fewer gaps.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I'm
I
answering
really
your question, actually, but I think my answer was good.
No, I think that's a great answer. And I think that, it highlights and reminds us that the value in education, it's not just an academic one. As you're speaking about the
Yep.
importance of getting back to life and that reassurance of routine and how important that is after or during or as you're resolving an emergency situation. I visited a community one year, and I had heard this exact same thing, and I was just astounded from a woman living in a little village, and they were often under rocket fire threat.
Mm.
And they would have sirens go off, if there was a warning that day or the potential of it. And she said to me, when the sirens go off, we go to our bomb shelters. And when the threat is over, we immediately resume our daily lives. We have the buses come to pick our kids up to go to school. And I'm thinking, my heart would be pounding. I don't even know how I would do that. Put my child on a bus and go to school. But they really recognize that the value of maintaining that routine in their day and getting back to life, as you said, was just so important.
Yeah. My PhD thesis was on education during war and emergencies, where I did an oral history study of Canadians, actually, who had survived and been forced to migrate as refugees during a war. But I didn't just do their regular oral history. I wanted their oral history of their education during the war that they lived through, and particularly World War II survivors. That was interesting because it was really before the UN existed, right? And so many of my participants from World War II spoke about sitting in bomb shelters, studying, because their mother said, if we're going to sit down here all day, you might as well do something. And even parents having created in different bomb shelters a corner for their child to study. And I've heard that in other crises. The key issue is if parents have been educated, they will make sure that their children are educated. So if they've already valuing it themselves, uh, even parents who don't have the highest education value it and ask for it. Uh, I've seen in some refugee scenarios in some of the poorest countries of the world where uh, when you start talking to the community and the community leaders in a refugee camp, the thing they most want to know about is the education of their children. And if you ask them, did they have access to education in the village they come from? They would be like, no, we didn't. But
Yes.
can our kids go to school here? Is this possible? So, some people consider this a pull factor for making refugee crises chronic. But it really also speaks to how the international community and governments, home governments, original governments, and host governments should prioritize education. Because when they don't, what happens is the young people get frustrated, and they grow up to be anyway adults, and adults without skills, literacy or numeracy. And then they can't develop if they don't have literacy and numeracy, at least. They can't develop a trade, even in some countries anyway. In other
Yep.
countries, they can develop a trade, but they may be not as highly skilled as they could be if they could read and write. Um, the international community doesn't have enough funds to support people for life on every single need, right? So it's actually
Mhm.
also in the best interest of the international community to ensure that refugees and displaced people have good access to good education, and actually learn, because we want them to be self-sufficient even within the refugee camp, no matter how many years they're going to live in a refugee camp. We want them to become self-sufficient adults. And that requires literacy and numeracy in almost every trade these days, even in developing countries. So it's essential. It's also essential for, ensuring economic and GDP growth, including of a host country, uh, because the refugees will contribute to that even while they're temporarily there, or even if temporary spreads into decades, as in the case of Palestine refugees. Their ability to contribute and to assist in the host community as well as in their own, has been an essential hallmark of their success over the last 75 years.
Mhm. So, Julia, for educators who are interested perhaps in a career at the United Nations or in volunteering or helping out maybe new graduates or picking a career path, what do you recommend they do?
So, I mean, the aid system is changing all the time. And now that I'm older, I'm not sure I have the right answer for young people. But uh, the internships that I had when I was young were essential. I think it's very important that you think about what skills you have and will bring to the sector. And sometimes the skill is your fluency in English, or your bilingualism if you're Canadian, in English and French. Um, which maybe you don't think that's a hard skill, but when you're working with people from all kinds of backgrounds and the reports need to be written in English, that becomes an essential skill. Um, Now there are management skills and there are technical skills, especially in education. And the same is true for health, of course, and other sectors, right? So it, many people expect that if they're a teacher, you can teach in a refugee camp. Except the reality is the education that we set up is going to be in the language of the
Right.
refugee, or the language of the curriculum of the host country. So um, that's not usually an option to be a teacher, but to be a technical advisor, to work in curriculum, to work in um, uh, capacity building, teacher trainers, of others. I mean, these are all options, and uh, to go into general leadership and management positions, you need to understand project cycle management and results-based management. Uh, and I think those are essential type of skills or uh, programs where you can learn and get those skills. But yes, the internship that I had with the Aga Khan Foundation was groundbreaking for me. I went into it. I was about as old as you could be and still be in that internship. You had to be under 30, and I think I was like 29. But it was really groundbreaking. It introduced me to a lot of people in the sector, some of whom I'm still friends or contacts with today, and really gave me a leg up. I knew I wanted by then that I wanted to go into development and or humanitarian assistance, and I knew that I wanted to be a bit of a leader in the area. I didn't think I wanted to be director at UNRWA. That was not like, you know, on my list of dream jobs. It wasn't quite there at that point, but um, these were important. It's not an easy life, though. I will say this, you know, uh, you have to think about what kind of personal life you want to have. I Many of my colleagues, of course, are married. I am not, and to be straight for the young people about that, and many people have children, and once you have children, you have to think about how you want to educate your own children, and that can be very difficult in war-torn countries. So, I mean, of course, there are international schools, but they're not always opened or they're not always the best. Or sometimes you're taking a job in an international context where you're not allowed to take your family, especially if you are focused on war and conflict. And so I think that young people need to be aware of that. There are a lot of people who work for a number of years in this sector and then they, retire out or they go and work in other
Hmm.
parts. So essentially, I think it's essential that you be realistic. It's very difficult to be realistic when you're young and idealistic, but you do need to think through all of those issues. It's not a great sector if you have high loans from university under your belt that you need to pay off because your salary when the internship phase is not very high, and sometimes your salary is not very high in other ones. But sometimes that's why people have partners who have jobs outside of aid. So
Hmm.
that is our reality in this sector. It's also not always easy to get into, um, and it, many people find it's not for them, particularly being exposed to war and conflict scenarios. It's highly stressful. You need to have a strong mental health capacity and resilience yourself, um, and be able to motivate others. That's really quite essential. I think uh, cross-cultural understanding is essential. Flexibility, willingness to pivot and pivot on your own morals and understandings. If you saw pictures of me in my Afghan refugee days, I used to wear hijab. There was no option. It wasn't
Hmm.
optional. So I think, people need to be willing to accept the local community and culture, learn some of the language, even if it's just a little bit, so that you can make people smile, that you're making an effort to fit in and understand them. Um, and yes, and be willing to understand that, of course, in developed countries, whichever, if you come from one, you have a lot of privileges, even if you think you don't. That you will immediately understand that the minute you step off a plane in not as a tourist, but to live and work in a developing country or in a war torn country. And I wish I could say I've seen people only see it as a humbling experience, but I've seen people who really cannot adjust to what they're seeing around them. And sometimes you just don't know until you actually do it, and it's okay if it's not for you.
Hmm. I know I've kept you a little while here, but this is just so interesting. I have another question for you. What was your own, as you're speaking of these experiences, can you speak of an experience you had yourself that really left an imprint on you or an impression as an educator or
Oh,
director?
so many, so many.
Pick pick the craziest one.
um, um, as an educator, like as it went during my classroom teaching time,
Didn't have
or
to be or even just in your current role working for United Nations, where you or in your internship or in your role where you've had to land somewhere that wasn't an emergency situation, or did you have an experience that really imprinted you and forever changed probably the way you look at life or the way you look at things? Is that too strong?
you know, the 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 I this isn't actually entirely work because the I was quite, in my view, privileged as a young person. So my parents often took us on holiday to different places, and this isn't about that. But the very first time I lived overseas, actually went to Egypt to study Arabic intensively for a year. It was right at the end of my bachelor's degree. I went to my graduation ceremony, and like 3 days later, I was on a plane to Cairo. And I remember like it was yesterday, the plane landing in Cairo. It was sunset. Of course, I'm jet lagged. I'd flown from Toronto to Amsterdam and then Amsterdam after a layover. And um, in Egypt, they actually have, it's kind of, they have such a big tourist industry there, although that's struggling these days. But this was 1992, so and they would fly the planes before they land over Cairo, so you can see the pyramids from the air. But for me, I'm looking out the window, looking at the rooftops, and um, Cairo is full of tall, medium-sized and sometimes tall apartment buildings, and they don't finish the roof because there's a doorman or a custodian type person who works in an apartment building called a boab, and they live on the roof. But even then, maybe the building owner, every few years, will build a couple more stories on top of this building. So when you fly over Cairo, what you see are people living on roofs. And it's just really, really population dense and really crowded. And I've never seen anything like this in my life. And I'd been to some developing countries already. And I, I broke down crying because I realized I was there going to be down on that ground for 1 year in about 5 minutes time or 10 minutes time. And as prepared as I felt my education of the Middle East and the area had made me, I felt in that second completely unprepared for what I was about to experience. Um, and the population density in a city like Cairo is not like anything we have in Canada, and certainly not like anything I had seen, even though I'd been to Malaysia actually and other places that were developing, but never to a city that big. And um, with poverty really in your face like that. And that was probably the most humbling moment of my entire adult life. In my career, I think one of my most humbling moments, and particularly my current job, which I've only had for 1 year, um, actually being appointed director of education at UNRWA, it was incredibly humbling. It's in itself. a humbling act to give somebody the awesome responsibility for the education of 543,000 children in 5 different fields of operation and 8,000 TVET trainees. I mean, this is much bigger than any other job I've ever had. And being the technical and strategic lead for the program is an awesome responsibility that I take very, very, very seriously, because I have been, given this responsibility by 2 UN agencies, because it's a joint effort between UNESCO and UNRWA. And it's sort of the biggest honor as somebody who's spent 25, 30 years almost now in the global education system. So that was another humbling moment. And then within that job in that last year, in August last year, I went to Gaza just before 5 weeks, as it turned out, before October 7th. 6 weeks, sorry. And it was the week before school was to open for the year. And they have a conference every year of all of the school principals. Because we had 8,000 teachers in Gaza, and over 200 schools in 183 buildings. So we had a lot of double shift. And so the ballroom in this hotel was packed. There were over 200 people in there, and they were all the school principals. And that was a beautiful moment, but also a frightening moment, because I was about 3 months into my job, 3 or 4 months into my job. And to stand at the front of that room and realize that from a technical point of view, they were all there to hear me. It was
Yes.
like, I'm not sure I have that much to say that's that important to stimulate them on and to give them the motivation to get through their school year. And every now and then, when I meet teachers, I meet our teachers, or a group of our teachers, or our school head teachers, or we call them principals. But I find that very humbling. When I meet the kids, I find it amazing, but also very difficult, because they know what they want, and we can't afford to give it to them every time, actually ever. And so how do we get those things? I often feel like I am humbled every day. Our staff, my team members in Amman regularly say, "Don't worry, Julia, we know we don't have the money, or we know it's not going to come easy, or we know we don't have the support for this. We'll find the way anyway." So yes, I think it's very important to be willing to be humbled every day by your job, and I am regularly. But it reminds me how important it is to be a strong leader and a committed leader to the issues, and particularly to refugee education, but also generally to education, in order to help lift the program and find the way forward.
Mm-hmm. I think it's just such a reminder. I think what you do is it's a gift that goes both ways. It's a gift to you in life, as you've described it, and a gift to the 500,000 plus students that you're overseeing. And I've always said that, it's so different being in the education system in Canada or the US, and, the problems and challenges that are faced, they seem so monumental at times. And then you land in one of these developing countries or an area that's experienced an emergency situation. And suddenly all of those things that seem so important back home, they become minuscule. And, when I visit children in schools that have very, very little, they're so excited to see me. And it doesn't matter if it was just colored pencils you brought. They're so excited about that. And
Yeah.
they feel so privileged
Yeah.
to have access to an education. And it just recharges your soul a little bit.
Yeah.
As much as it takes a bit in sadness, it also recharges your soul a little bit. And
Yeah.
I feel so blessed to have had that experience and an opportunity.
But
Always.
I've had students in fairly privileged circumstances when I was teaching, and they remind me, between them and the kids that I oversee, whose program I oversee right now, and others that I've overseen in developing countries, uh, it how important a good teacher is. It doesn't matter how wealthy the kid is. If a good teacher is somebody they will remember for life. I actually keep in touch with two of my teachers. They're married to one another. So I keep in touch with one of them. and from my high school days, from my middle school and high school days. And you know, I still call them Mr. and Mrs. Like, even though I'm in my 50s, I can't use their first names. They keep telling me, like, nope, sorry, can't do it. and and they, you know, the husband was my high school political science teacher, so he is as responsible for where I've come and my love for the Middle East as anybody else, even though it was probably some accident that he assigned me to a Middle Eastern country in that exercise. But there's a saying in the education world that many people used to put it on their email signatures, like maybe 10 years ago. If you can read this, thank a teacher. And it's true, right?
Mhm.
You as a teacher make such an impact on a person's life, and you often don't know because you don't keep up with that person, and you don't finish watching them grow. And sometimes you get an opportunity to see one of your former students or to meet them, and you just realize that you had a huge effect on that person, on the making of that person, on who they ultimately became. And you didn't even know, even at the time, let alone later. Um, and when I moved from teaching to program management and leadership, I did it without thinking that of what I would lose by not being involved on a day-to-day basis with just 30 lives. I did it because I thought I could take my philosophy and go bigger, and I can help more kids and help more people. And as much as that's true, I don't feel the effects of having just 30 kids that whose lives I'm helping to shape and change, not just in whatever I'm teaching them, but in sharing in the hidden curriculum and the null, in changing their life for the better, and regardless of what level of privilege they're coming from or going to. That is what is the joy and the beauty of teaching, and something that uh, I, I hope in the sunset of my career I'll find my way back to a classroom of some kind and be able to share my experience again. I have a small group of young adults in my field that I have mentored on and off over the last 10 to 15 years. And that helps to keep me grounded in reality by listening to real, even though they're a small subset and I don't have enough time for them these days, they've really helped me uh, still think like a teacher by having just one person telling me I have all of these problems with my new job or with the job I'm trying to get, or and trying to help them work through that. Um, Reminds me about the important roles that teachers play that aren't their official roles, that are actually more important than their official roles.
Absolutely. I could talk to you. I could listen to you forever, Julia.
Thanks, Annette.
But wrap up question. Okay, so we're
Yeah.
doing this really interesting thing where we have the previous guest, who's a leader in education, leave a question for the future guest without knowing who they're going to be or what their role is going to be.
Oh,
So your wrap up question comes from 𝗘𝘅𝗽𝗲𝗰𝘁, the Director of Education Technology at Red Deer Catholic Regional Schools.
okay.
So 𝗘𝘅𝗽𝗍's question was, from all of the technologies at one point in time that you weren't a fan of, which one has evolved for you that made you a big supporter or proponent for it?
Oh, wow.
I know. I had to really think about this.
Okay. Here's one. And it's not a technology that I necessarily have. Well, I've used it in school, sure. But I'm not a fan, to be honest, of okay, there's a couple of things I'm not a fan of, and I'm afraid to say it because some of them are owned by big corporations.
Me too. Be brave. You've got this.
Okay. I'm not really that much of a fan of the Microsoft suite of Office, and in particular Excel. So, but I have come to appreciate that it is what kids who want to have a future and it's an office job of any kind need to learn.
Yes. That's a good one. My team, I was the opposite. In corporate, we were always using Microsoft, but a lot of the teachers I work with, and even my own team coming on board that are younger now,
Yeah.
they love Google Drive and everything Google and Google Sheets. And they're always trying to share my documents in Google. And then Google won't use all the tools that I had in Excel all the time. And so we have a little tug of war, but that's an absolutely fabulous one. Like, they hate Microsoft. They don't get it. They don't get why I use the desktop app. It probably ages me that I do. I don't even
At the start of the pandemic, I was not with UNRWA. I was still with the government of Canada at the time, and one of the first things they did was roll out MS Teams and sort of more a cloud version of the Microsoft suite. And I had on my team at the time, I had some older Gen X's and even maybe a couple of boomers. And I had these very young Gen Z/younger millennials. And I had already had this system going where I'd kind of paired them because the IT skills were not like the same. But as soon as we rolled this out and, you had this situation where everybody could write on a document at the same time, the team loved it. From a managerial point of view, I didn't love it because I didn't really think it was worth the time of 6 people trying to type on the same document at the same time. I didn't think that was really effective, efficient use of their time. But we were all in the first 2 or 3 weeks of working from home for the pandemic. So I was trying to be, I never said anything to anyone there. And if they're listening to this podcast and you use this part, they're going to be like, really unhappy with me. But I was really not sure about that at the time. And over time that I've seen this, we have the same systems in all the jobs I've had since the pandemic. And I see less and less people using it, not simultaneously using it, even though they can. I once had a supervisor many, many, many years ago. My very first boss, actually, when I was a lifeguard. And she talked about one day, as an anecdote to something else, how she read that people have not adjusted to the elevator. And that's why when you get in an elevator, everybody looks up at the board to see the numbers changing, because not all elevators have those anymore, I realize, but but she said because they're not adjusted to it. They haven't, their brain subconsciously doesn't quite believe that they're going up or down. And so everybody in the elevator is looking up at the numbers moving. And I was like, huh, that was a real aha moment for me. And I keep that in my mind, that I think actually nobody ever fully adjusts. We maybe take what we want from digital technology, and if we can't get it, or some parts, even though it looks cool, or our neighbor is using it in a very cool way, and if we can't do that, we just drop it and go to something else, or we find a workaround that works for us, which I'm sure the IT leaders don't love. They love to think that we use it as they've designed it, but we're still adjusting. We're still looking up at the numbers on the elevators even now. So I think, I think that would be my answer to that question.
I don't think they always design with the end user in mind. And I always say, just
No,
because you can, just because 6 people can work on a document at the same time does not mean that they should work on it. I
right?
see no efficiency in that whatsoever.
Me
In fact,
neither.
my book coach, when I was writing my book, she's the big Google fan. And when she puts out books, she says, when I put it for first draft for editing, I put it out to my beta readers and I put it into a Google and I tell them to hack it up, make a mess of it. And I'm like, no, that's not happening with my book. One person can edit it at a time, leave their comments, and I will decide if I'm going to accept
Right?
or reject
And it's your
them.
book. If they want to write their own book, they should go write their own book.
Well, it's supposed to be for editing, that they'll catch things. But I feel like, if they're overlapping one, I don't know, just my brain could not accept the disorganization factor of having, but she does it fabulously. And I mean,
Yeah.
that's her, that's her working style. But for me, I'm like, no.
At one point in 2020, I did ask some of my younger colleagues, because they were ranting about how amazing this innovation was, and I said to them, so just a question, because when I was going to school, we weren't yet always using student-centered teaching and group work. It was sometimes happen, but it wasn't endemic. And I'd watched other young people who, let's say, are now in their late 20s, who were growing up in a Canadian education system, which was much more about group work or pairs, and constantly everything was a project. And so I asked my team members, like, when you went to school, was it a lot of this kind of collaborative group work? And they were like, yeah, absolutely. I was like, okay, you were socialized by your hidden curriculum to this.
Yep,
That's why
exactly.
you love it, because in my generation, this was not what we did in school.
No, exactly. I will send it to you. You will track your changes. You can share it back with me.
Exactly.
So, Julia, is there anything today? What if I not asked you that you'd like to make sure that people know about UNRWA?
Oh, I think I would really like people to understand that UNRWA has an education system that is robust, that has made and continues to make a huge difference in the lives and in the futures of Palestine refugees, in who they become and who they are, and that we are doing our best to ensure that Palestine refugee children are able to realize their right to education robustly and transparently and honestly, and that we are trying to ensure that they have an understanding of UN values of anti-hate, anti-discrimination, peace, and tolerance, and understanding, and are able to action the kind of life and make life decisions later that will help them in a very complicated situation, in a very complicated world that they live in, a very violent world that they live in. And I hope that people will understand that what you hear in the media is not the reality that our children are facing on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. And that is a really important message, that what we see on the news and the reality when we're boots on the ground and what children experience in these situations, they're completely different.
Yeah.
Julia, thank you so much for joining us today. Your insights on refugee education and emergency education have been so insightful and so valuable. And I really, really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, Annette.